I say a few things about Dr. Lenore Grenoble, who is a professor at University of Chicago. She specializes in language contact and shift within indigenous communities with a focus on Arctic regions. Her empirically driven work explores multilingual language use among Arctic indigenous populations, examining linguistic, social, and cognitive factors related to language contact and shift. Currently, she is engaged in collaborative projects on language revitalization, working to develop sustainable language practices. And Professor Dr. Grenoble's field work spans the Russian far north, the Arctic, the Greenland, with numerous books and publication and volumes, of course, in high-impact journals. She's a member of American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She has also been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, a fellowship from ACLS, and served as a Fulbright Arctic Distinguished Chair in Norway 2018. Last but not least, her work has been supported by grants from NSF Program in Linguistics and the Program in Documenting Endangered Languages. Before I give her the room to present, I first want Zoe to say a few words about her as well.
Yeah, I'll be very, very brief. I would like to say that Lenore is an active and valued member of the Department of Linguistics here at the University of Chicago, and I'm really grateful to her. The reason is that she was the department chair when I first applied for a visiting position, and it was her acceptance that made it possible. So her support played a significant role in bringing me to Chicago, and I'm really grateful to you, Lenore. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this. And really, Zoe, it would be impossible not to support you. I mean, you're such a fabulous scholar. How could we not bring you here? So thank you. I'm going to share my slides now. And there we go. So everybody can see that okay? So I have a lot of slides. Please don't faint about that. I'm just going to talk for, just until 11:30 or 7:30, depending on what time zone you're in, and then we'll move forward to some discussion. This is the overall outline of the talk, and I'm really very interested in the questions and the methodological and theoretical underpinnings more than I am in the data at this moment, because I think these are sort of the data is supporting some of the questions, but I don't know that I have full answers for my questions. I will thank the funders who have supported this, both the National Science Foundation here in the US and a mega grant from the Russian government. And the work that I will be talking about today was largely based at the Arctic Linguistic Ecology Lab at Northeastern Federal University. We are now not funded, but we put in a grant at about 3 a.m. this morning. So I and my team are all a little exhausted. This is about half of the team in Yakutsk. I'll show you on the map where we are. This is a very northern region. If you Google Yakutsk, you will see that it usually comes up as the coldest city in the world. And so we are wearing down vests in the lab picture here. And the two sort of stars who've done a lot of the work with me here are both Evan, Elena, and Boris. So we'll come back to them. And I really want to thank Sarah, who has been doing a lot of the data processing with me. She's a high school student here in Chicago and has been doing this as a labor of love. So I just really appreciate her wading through the data. Some undergraduate students have also been working on this, but Sarah is really the one who's done a lot of the work for this particular talk. So let me start by giving you the big questions that I'm not really going to fully answer here. These are the questions, a little bit what we were talking about before I started this formal talk, this formal part of the talk, but really the question is, what are the linguistic consequences of language shift? And how does the language of shifting speakers compare to that of heritage speakers? So I'm presupposing that there are heritage speakers. We just talked that maybe that's something worth talking about. But are shifting speakers heritage speakers, or are there linguistic differences? I'm not going to answer that today. There are definite social differences between these different groups of speakers. Whether that is reflected in their language, I think, is an open question. And a big question that is driving my research now is, how do we capture the multilingual practices of these communities? And I'll come back to that in particular as we get into some of the data. So just so that we're on the same page, language shift is happening on a global level, with estimates between 50 to 90% of the world's languages will be lost over the course of the century. And the major cause of loss is language shift. Yes, some languages have been lost because the speakers have been killed through war, disease, natural disaster. But by and large, what we are talking about when we talk about language loss is shift, where the children cease learning the language, whatever you want to call that language, the heritage language, which means something in a different concept, the ancestral language, the indigenous language, or I can call it neutrally language A, and they shift almost always to the language of a majority population. Currently, we're experiencing very rapid language shift over the course of a single generation, but we don't experience this in communities, even in very small communities. It's generally not uniform across the community. It doesn't happen in one fell swoop, but speakers vary in the pace. So there'll be some children who are still speaking the language and some people who aren't at all. So there is variation in that, but we find that the children can often not speak to their grandparents, maybe even their parents in language A, if you will. So this is not a new problem. This was something that was identified in the 90s by linguists, and was identified by speaker communities earlier. Revitalization started earlier than before linguists really started paying attention to it, but linguistics as a whole. And the push from the linguistic community has been to document languages while they are still spoken. And there have been a lot of advances in that, and we've gotten a lot of data, but the push has largely been to document, to record the most proficient, the best speakers, the last speakers while they are still there, especially with highly endangered languages. The idea being, once they're gone, we won't have those records, and they're certainly valuable. I'm not saying that they're not valuable, but we are missing some of the things that do go on in shift, and that's where my research is currently focused. So by and large, when we do that, we are documenting single languages, and we are documenting them as if they were individual languages spoken by monolingual communities. But as I just defined shift, that's not what's actually happening, because speakers are shifting to another language. So there is at least a second language spoken in that community, and we are missing that. So we are missing the multilingualism, we're missing the actual process of shift, and we're missing variation in these communities, especially if we're working with 1, 2, 3 of these really last older proficient speakers. So those are the things that I am interested in, and I'm really working out how to get some of these things. So the questions, really, what are the linguistic repercussions of language shift, or obsolescence, as Dorian called it in 1989? If you go back and look at that 1989 volume, which a group of us have been doing, a lot of the vocabulary is really dated, like obsolescence. But a question is, to what extent are changes systematic? Are they systematic for individual speakers across speech communities? Do we have speech communities of speakers who are shifting? This is an open question. So if you have that younger generation is not using language A very much, maybe when they're speaking to their grandparents or their parents, are they using it among themselves? We just don't have a sense of that. Do these shifting speakers compare to heritage speakers at all? If there is rapid shift across them, if there's innovation in the language of the shifting speakers, does it spread? Can we look at language change and process spreading across the community, or is it just restricted to the individual speaker? And can we identify an order of loss? So of course, here with this question, I'm presupposing that there is loss in the linguistic system of the shifting speakers, but we know we have borrowing hierarchies, and these have been fairly robustly tested. I just saw Yaron Matras, and he was talking about this again. We have in contact, and language shift is about contact, we have pretty good evidence of some borrowing hierarchies. Do we have a loss hierarchy? Are there things that are lost before other things? And does the order of loss mirror the order of acquisition? So one theory is that the last acquired things, and this is sort of aimed at the psycholinguists and people working with child acquisition, the more complicated syntax is acquired later. Is that the stuff that's lost first? We could get a lot of data on this because a lot of languages are shifting, but we don't really have enough comparable data to answer these questions right now. So in particular, in that Dorian volume, there's an article by Campbell and Munsell. Hans-Jürgen Sasse wrote a lot about this, but there's some work looking at the specific linguistic consequences of language shift. One is loss. Loss being loss of phonological distinctions, morphology, reduction in the lexicon, paradigmatic leveling, reduction of allomorphy, stylistic shrinkage. There's a theory of negative borrowing. Dorian doesn't find any conclusive evidence, but Sasse said that this is quite a common phenomenon. One theory is that we get simplification as languages are shifting with a loss of syntactic complexity, that complex syntactic constructions are replaced by analytic ones. But there do seem to be complexity trade-offs, and I've argued about this and argued for that in some of my work, that simplification in one area may lead to complication in the grammar in another area or in the structure. And then there's a claim that there is restructuring of the language, again, language A, as speakers are shifting to B. So these claims were put forth a number of years ago. Campbell and Munsell is a really good place to look for that. And Sasse also lists them at a time when we didn't have the methodologies that we have now. So we have new methodologies, new ways of getting bigger data to make this more comparable comparisons across shifting communities, so we can answer these questions in a more rigorous way as opposed to a little bit more anecdotally, I would say. So one of the goals in my work over the last few years has been to get controlled data that we can compare across speakers. So the idea is to get maximally comparable samples from different speakers, and then we can compare how common social variables among the people have, if they correlate with linguistic outcomes, to see how distinct or decayed, which is the older term that was, we don't use that kind of language anymore. Are the grammars of these shifting speakers distinct, decaying, and are there features that are common? So for this reason, we are bringing experimental methods to the field. This is quite a common thing for people who are looking at heritage speakers, who do a lot of work in lab settings to get comparable data so you can make comparisons across the speakers. But working in the field is a little bit different. So that's where I'm first going to talk about this. And also just to highlight, and this is something that's been coming up in a lot of conferences. I was in a lot of the conferences in Europe this summer. Some of you certainly were there. Who we test as we test these theories, by and large, our theories about acquisition and loss are tested on weird populations, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. I kind of highlight democratic with recent issues in the US. But putting that aside, so we've been looking, a lot of the large data testing is with weird populations. The populations I'm working with are not weird. They're not Western. I'm working with indigenous people, as you heard in the introduction. And then the other thing is how we test. So when we test things in the field, the setting is quite different from the lab setting. So depending on how you run things in your university, but at the University of Chicago, we often give undergraduate students research credit, or we give them a gift card. They come into the lab, they know what they're supposed to do. They do their task, they're there for half an hour or an hour. They may not all be Western students, but they're in this Western weird setting of the University of Chicago. They're all of relatively the same age. They do what they're supposed to do, they get their gift card, and they go. End of story. In the field, things don't work like that. It's very difficult to get to control the setting exactly the same way, depending on what your field conditions are. So largely in my work, we often go to people's homes rather than a lab, or if I set up somewhere, they come to me. We don't put limitations on time for specific tasks, so we aren't measuring response time, in particular because the populations that I'm working with are under duress. They're stressed, and shifting speakers tend to feel very bad about how they're speaking language A. They're often shamed in their community for not speaking it well, and this is just adding too much stress to people who are already experiencing some kind of trauma. In general, where there's language shift, there's some sort of social trauma, and so we don't test response time. We do talk to speakers about their intuitions, and I don't know why this got red there. And we do, ask them for how they feel about certain tasks and incorporate that into our experiments and build on them. And then there is a very complicated power dynamic between researchers and consultants in the field. Of course, there's a power dynamic in the linguistic lab at a university as well. There's generally faculty, maybe graduate students, postdocs, and other people. In the field, it's even more complicated because the people running the experiments are often outsiders. I go in, I'm a foreigner. I have a different kind of status than I would if I were, let's say I'm working in Siberia, than an ethnic Russian. But still people react to me differently. Sometimes people think I'm Russian. And so it gets quite complicated. So you want to keep that in mind. What I find is that speakers often they get so excited that I'm even interested in their language that they will say things that aren't really correct, or doing things like having them correct my speech doesn't work because they're so happy. Anything I say is fine with them. Whereas if I were speaking Spanish here, Spanish speakers would correct my Spanish. There's just this very different dynamic going on. So now I would like to take you to the field and we'll look at the speakers and the data. We are going to go to the Arctic. So I work in this area. So here's the US is down here. Greece doesn't show up on this map, but you can see here Scandinavia, and the Arctic Circle is right here. This red line or the green line depend on, most people would consider people living above that space, north of that space, to be Arctic, even though technically speaking, it's just above the Arctic Circle. The population is very thin once you get that far north. But I work over in this region here, a little bit here, and in Greenland. And today we are going to go to the Sakha Republic of Yakutia, and which is here in red. It is part of the Russian Federation. You can see that it extends all the way down from China up to the Laptev Sea. So this is all very, very cold communities here. And the languages that I'm going to talk a little bit about are Sakha, Evan, and Evenki. So let me switch here. I'm going to just give you a sense of the field conditions. You just get a little sense of what it looks like. Can you see that okay? This is not actually an area that I worked in. This is my colleagues here who are doing the recording. You can see a lot of this is done. This was done after the outbreak of COVID. And so people are wearing masks. The Sakha Republic, the thing to know about it is it's 6 times the size of France. And there are about 1 million people living there. And so there's very low population density, and people are living in these small villages in very remote areas. Many of them are, if they're in the remote area, they're living a subsistence or partial subsistence lifestyle. And you can see they still use dog sleds to get around. And the dogs are an important part of the hunting community. They're reindeer herders, hunters. And this is, I think this was in late March or April that this team went to the field. And you can tell because it's light out. It's clearly pretty warm weather for this area. People are out having a good time. And it's in these communities, as long as they're quite isolated, we don't see much shift. But once the outside world gets there, we see a lot of shift. This particular group is highly multilingual, and the elders, these younger guys probably not, but the older speakers have 4 or 5 different languages that they use. So this team that went was documenting the multilingualism there and trying to get a handle on what's going on there. So let's look at the data and the kinds of speakers. Is everybody seeing these red lines? I don't know where these red lines came. Can't get rid of, sorry about that. I thought it was on that one slide, but it seems to be appearing everywhere. Anyways, try to ignore them. So who are the different speakers in these communities? And the endangered language researchers have been very concerned in understanding and obtaining a typology of speakers. So Grenoble and Baird have probably the most comprehensive typology of speakers, starting with fluent speakers, semi-speakers, new speakers, all the way down. Is a very detailed. It's too detailed. There's too many speakers here. I don't see any reason, if you do a sort of bottom-up kind of approach, to distinguish these different categories. So there may be reasons in some work, but I just haven't found it in my own work that we need to look at them. One group that's worth distinguishing are the new speakers, who are speakers who are L2 learners of the language. There's been a lot of research done on this in Europe, in particular in Irish. They are speakers who learn the language as adults. Are they any different than L2 speakers of, let's say, I decide to go learn Spanish tomorrow? Linguistically, probably not. That would be an open question. There's a social motivation there. I have no Spanish in my heritage, but these are Irish speakers who are Irish and are learning Irish out of a sense of commitment to the community. So, but that's I don't have speakers like that. I just don't find those kind of speakers in Siberia. For me, the issue are the fluent speakers, the semi-speakers, and attriting speakers. So this is enough. So we're going to look at non-shifting speakers. Often these are called traditional speakers as we move away from notions of native speakers, but speakers who are speaking a system of the language that has the system that we expect. And perhaps innovative speakers also belong here. If these are speakers who are using the language all the time and speak it and can say whatever they want to say in that target language. We do need to distinguish between attriting speakers. Dorian calls them rusty speakers, speakers who acquired the full system, or we think they acquired the full system, but stopped using it, versus the shifting speakers, what Dorian, Zasa call semi-speakers. They did not acquire the full linguistic system that the L1 speakers acquired, but there was probably some kind of interrupted transmission, and you can get this by looking at their linguistic histories. Sometimes this is called divergent attainment, interrupted acquisition, insufficient input. That's really an open question as to what's going on with them. But we do want to look at least along 2 parameters. One is acquisition history, exposure and usage, and overall proficiency. The reason to look at these is if I'm interested in change, I need to know what they're changing from to and what they're changing to. And so proficiency does become an issue here, as does acquisition. And there are some intersecting challenges. You're establishing a baseline. You need to know what their input is. This is absolutely a question that we see in heritage language research, right? You can't expect speakers, let's say Greek speakers in Chicago, whose parents speak Greek from a village. They're going to speak that Greek and not the Greek that is spoken in Athens or learned in the schools, right? So we need to establish that baseline. We need to think about sort of normal garden variety variation, which is rampant throughout all language use. And then for me, it's very important to distinguish between these attriters and shifters. And in particular, if you're doing field work and you're working in a community where the language is not used on a daily basis, those attriters, the more you work with them, they start to remember things. Even if without your input, you're just sort of activating something in their brain and they will start remembering things. I think many people, L2 speakers, have this experience. You learn Greek in school and then you go to Greece and you start remembering things just because you're embedded in this environment where you're using the language. The shifters, when we work with them in the field, they start learning things through the process of elicitation. And the output there is quite different. You're getting what the shifters have learned, whereas the attriters, you're getting what they remember, what they learned from other speakers versus what they're learning in the linguistic elicitation. These aren't unique problems in endangered language communities, but they are exacerbated by very small numbers of speakers. So we often have a difficult time finding a control group. And the social circumstances also make this difficult. If they've been told that speaking this language means that you're stupid, or that they're stupid because they don't speak the language well, this can really have an impact. I realize that some of these psychological problems also apply to immigrants speaking a heritage language, but they're really exacerbated in endangered language communities. We care very much about this, as Zasa has pointed out. The locus of what he calls language decay is the semi-speaker. In other words, the shift that's actually happening is happening in the speaker's brain, right? And that's where production is taking place. And so we want to figure out what is going on with those speakers. And there's quite a difference here. The shifting speakers, the command of the language is from the outset imperfect, this is Zasa, versus these attriters who develop from former fluent speakers, former L1 speakers. So in this project that I'm talking about, we have used a lot of different methods to collect data, to get at different kinds of data and be able to assess things. I won't go through all of them, but let me give you a little bit of a taste. First of all, self-assessment. In a pilot study, we worked with 30 Saha University students, and here we're replicating what goes on in the linguistic lab at the University of Chicago with one critical difference, and it's an important one. We were able to force them to do this. So in Chicago, we invite people to the lab and they get their research credit, or they get their Amazon gift card. Here, it was part of their classwork and they had to come. This is important because in general, the weaker speakers, the less proficient speakers, are reluctant to do any of these tasks. Here they were required to because they were in the class. So they all identified as Saha. Saha, remember, is a Turkic language. They identified as ethnic Saha. They were able to opt out of the task in Saha if they couldn't do it. All university instruction is in Russian. So it's completely possible to speak only Russian in this university. And we had them perform 2 tasks after they did a sociolinguistic questionnaire. They did controlled sentence production and then more freer elicitation with a series of pictures. So when I look at the self-assessment and we published this, there were 30 speakers, which for any endangered language community, there's a lot of Saha speakers, 350,000, but still is a pretty good sample size. All of them spoke Russian. They had to be in the university. 28 of them said they spoke Saha. So again, they all identified as ethnic Saha. And 2 of those 28 said they spoke with difficulty. 5 said they spoke, but they couldn't read or write in Saha. So already just these numbers show that we have language shift in the Saha population. This has been independently verified. So this is just a small sample, but we see out of a total of 30, only 21 are fully functional, And essentially through our test, we saw a strong correlation between their performance and their self-assessment. In other words, if they said they couldn't do it, they basically couldn't do it. If they said they weren't very good, they made a lot of mistakes, what would be considered mistakes by L1 speakers. Another method, which is quite popular in the Siberian context, but very time-consuming, and I don't think it's applicable to all contexts, is described by Nikolai Vakhtin, who's an expert in this. And it is what he calls a community expert assessment. So ideally, you go into the community and you find 3 people who are local experts who know the language very well. And in these small communities, people do know who the good speakers are and who the not good speakers are. You go through a list of absolutely everybody in the village with each of these people individually, and they will tell you, oh yeah, this person speaks well, this person doesn't speak well. And you can get a really good sense of what's going on in terms of proficiency and shift or not shift in the village, if you can identify 3 of them. This requires the right kind of social organization. You need a village where everybody knows everybody, and there's a list of residents. This happens to be the case in Russia, and a clear sense of who is an expert, which also in these Russian communities, they're, as in Russia, not ethnically Russian, they actually do know, and that's been my experience in the small communities. People know who's a good speaker, who's not a good speaker, and what that means to them, and you can test that linguistically, and it maps out pretty well. It's very time-consuming, and you're not getting linguistic data, you're only getting the sociolinguistic data. O'Grady and some colleagues determined another method for testing proficiency with body parts. You show a picture, and their argument is that more commonly used or named body parts are more likely to be retained in that target language, whereas less common ones are not. We found in testing this, again, we weren't measuring response time, but we did find in testing this that speakers, you'd be asking them in the target language, say Evan, and then they start with, like, they couldn't remember, and they'd be pointing here and they say, look at in Russian. So they knew the word for elbow and they were thinking in Russian and then translating in their head. But this didn't turn out to be worth the amount of time that it took to do it with speakers. It takes a fair amount of time, and you have limited amount of time with the speakers, and we just weren't getting enough value out of that time. So we abandoned this. We do have a sociolinguistic questionnaire that was developed as part of another project, developed with Indigenous participants from all over the Arctic, and they had really objected to other sociolinguistic questionnaires that have a monolingual bias, because most of them are bi or multilingual to varying degrees. They object to the assumptions in questionnaires that all members of a household speak the same languages and have the same repertoire, and they wanted more open-ended questions. So we developed this in conjunction with them using a Likert scale to test. We're testing self-assessment, but also attitudes, kind of basic sociolinguistic questions. This questionnaire was translated into Russian and then in Sakha. And so what we have, and we have thousands of these now, thanks to the size of the team, we tried to do it written, but we weren't getting very rich answers. So instead, we have L1 speakers of the target language conduct the survey in the target language, speaking to people. They move from structured questions to open-ended interviews. And so everybody collects critical data there, date of birth, whatever they can about the person's language history. The good interviewers with the right interlocutors get long conversations in the target language. So we're getting sociolinguistic data and open-ended linguistic data, which we can analyze to actually see how these people are speaking the language. Of course, we can't forget that power dynamic there. The interviewer is not only fluent, but is also from Yakutsk, the capital city, and has some prestige in that, but still, it's all in that language. And so we've gotten pretty good data there. Those are the results. So let me move into this. We we started with 17 pictures, and we've moved to a 27 picture model where we have a picture. We give people the stimuli in the target language using the citation form, which is the form available in the dictionary. In in Russia and in Greenland, we've been replicating these experiments in Greenland, people are all literate. I didn't think they would be literate enough to do this task, but they are. And so we were testing word order, giving the verb first to see if the target languages in Russia are all verb final, or we would anticipate that they would be verb final, but Russian word order depends on discourse. So we gave them these targets without any context, just the context of the pictures. They would build sentences without larger discourse, and just to test word order. We found that we got very rich data from this, even though it seems like a stupid experiment. It seems very simplistic, but, and other linguists look at it, it's amazing the kind of data we get. So we did see that speakers sort of across the board, if they could do this task, they could manage the intransitive verbs. Once we get to transitive verbs, that was much harder. And once we have ditransitives, many, many speakers crash and burn. They just can't use ditransitive verbs, even though the sentences are quite simple, like this. The boy is building a house. So that most people could do. But if you say the boy is building a house with blocks, it really is very, very hard for the less proficient speakers. We also collected narratives using this short little video so that we had more free text to compare to the controls. So one thing that we are finding that I think differs from heritage research is often speech rate is used as a proxy for proficiency. That doesn't work in these communities because there's a general speaking style that is slow. And in particular, in a lot of indigenous communities, the older speakers speak more slowly. Everybody thinks that they're more slowly than the younger speakers. Everyone assumes that those older speakers are more proficient, and by and large, they are the traditional speakers who aren't shifting. But we see that speech rate doesn't really correspond to proficiency. What does, however, is lexical variation. When we look at these free narratives from the video, the more proficient speakers use a huge range of lexical items, and their stories tend to be longer. Of course, there's individual speaker differences in telling stories. Some people just tell short stories, or they're bored with the task. But we see that the more proficient speakers have much more lexical variation. And this is just on the lexical level. There's some syntactic differences. So let's move forward and look at this a little bit. We see proficiency over the course of the whole interview situation, because if the interviewer is speaking the target language, the consultant can manage it or not. And sometimes the consultant switches to the majority language, in this case, Russian. And they can have, sometimes we have these kind of passive bilinguals where the consultant will be speaking Russian and the interviewer can continue in Even. And sometimes the interviewer just switches to Russian. And so you can tell just actually by how the consultant is behaving. So let us go and look at what's happening in Berezovka, which is a village where I have been working. It's an Even dominant village. It's quite isolated. You need to drive for 7 hours on this road. 7 hours if the conditions are good. That's not really a road. It's just plowed snow. So you can only get there at certain times of the year. If the ground isn't frozen, you just can't get there. So they're quite isolated. And they are one of the two villages that's more robustly maintaining Even. It's here, way up here. So this is the Gulag, if you've read Solzhenitsyn. Up here, this is Chukotka, Alaska's over here. We're going to go about here, and here's Yakutsk, the capital. So if we start looking now specifically at language change, have no idea why that red mark is still here. It's really bothering me. I hope it's not bothering you. But so Even is agglutinating, V final, and has a lot of cases depending on the dialect, 12 to 13, something like that, and has nice accusative marking. You can see the morphophonemics here are very regular. If the stem ends in a vowel like ju, then you get the bilabial fricative. If it ends in a consonant u, the nasal m, you get u, the velar nasal u. But if it ends in the n, the accusative, the predicted accusative is m. And This is agglutinating language. So if we add the plural marker L, that's the plural, the accusative goes after it, bu. So jewel is houses, and then we have jewel bu. But this is, garden variety agglutination that you would teach. You could use this as a problem set in an introductory linguistics class, nice and clear. Very regular. In the 27 picture production task, we have a small set of nouns. We tried high frequency nouns because when we were testing, designed this experiment, we were testing for word order. So we didn't want the lexicon to be a problem. And we gave speakers, some people didn't they used a different regional word for birds, just said, use whatever word you want. So they had the option to do this. These are pretty common words. You can see fish, house. These are communities that fish. And they sort of across all of these categories, there's a large number of them that end in N. And what we found was that these N stem nouns are causing innovation. We're seeing a lot of innovation in the accusative marking. So we expect M, we expect loss of that N to be changed to M, and what we're getting, regardless of the noun, it seems, these 4 nouns, it pops up 12 different kind of unexpected forms here. And for me, the most surprising is the word girl, which is very high frequency. 4 people didn't mark the accusative. 1 person took the nominative and added oo, which would be fine, except not for these words. 1 person added the accusative M and then double marked it. We see that 1 person did this here. And then 4 people made mistakes with the word for ball. So this was unexpected because I consider this a core argument marking, high frequency, and I just thought, boy, you should know how to make the accusative case. So once you sort of go into the deeper data, 1 speaker produced 1/3 of the unexpected forms that we just saw. And here we can distinguish between these traditional speakers and innovative speakers. So, and how do we interpret this data? Does it mean that we are just losing this, this ending that's odd, right? This is just an allomorph restricted to these end stems. They are high frequency. You saw from the prompts that there were a lot of end stems. That wasn't a deliberate decision. We were just using high frequency nouns. We find that we're, just seeing this with them in particular. It does look like if you look just across the paradigm, there's an awful lot of ooh here, even with this plural marking. So you can see why speakers might be tempted to just level this. The question is, where is this coming from? Is this the result of language contact? Both Saha and Russian, which Evan is in contact with, or Evan speakers are in contact with, have differential object marking. So in Russian, there is 0 marking in the accusative for masculine singular inanimate nouns, and for all plural inanimate nouns, just a 0 marking. Depending on your theory, you might say that's the nominative, say it's the accusative. I consider it a 0 morpheme. In Saha, we have a 0 morpheme for non-specific indefinite objects, and then accusative morpheme appears for definite or specific objects. So we could think that these changes are the result of contact with 2 languages that have differential object marking. Yet I see no evidence for this. It is not the case that Evan speakers are just starting to distinguish animacy as in Russian, nor are they starting to distinguish definiteness as in Saha. Instead, it just looks like paradigmatic leveling, which is what Campbell and Munsell predict. Moreover, if we look at the speakers themselves who are making these unexpected forms, they by and large tend to be the younger, less proficient speakers. So from my perspective, what's interesting here, and I've highlighted in blue, is that language internal resources are being used. It's not the case that they are picking up and using a Russian morpheme or a Saha morpheme here. They're just leveling within Evan. And I've singled out this particular example to illustrate this point because it's pretty clear. There's much more complicated ones we're finding in other languages like Chukchi, which is a bit of a beast. It's polysynthetic, so it's hard to process in a talk like this. But we are seeing in general a tendency for these shifting speakers to use language internal resources as they are speaking a system that differs from that of the more traditional speakers. That's kind of one of the takeaways. It's not the case that there's no interference from the majority language, but it's not exactly what you would expect. And so if we go here, we're going to go to Evenki, which is closely related to Evan. Here in Tura, which is outside of the Saha Republic, where the languages, these indigenous languages are more, shift is slower to come here. They're more robustly spoken because of language policies in the Saha Republic, whereas over here, this is outside of the Republic. Moscow's way over here. We're still very far away, but those language policies are much more Russian dominant. And so we see much more advanced shift. Here, this was in 2008, we collected some frog stories using a frog book that has a turtle in it. And what we found was one speaker was putting the accusative marking. You can see that this is cognate to Evan, but it's got a vowel on it. Putting the accusative marking everywhere in subject position. So this is just a weird, unexpected thing. Also, this speaker used a lot of code mixing. So the blue here is Russian. And, you know, this is a kind of crazy sentence here that shows, I think this is where my questions about heritage speakers come up, because I think the data here are a lot like what we see with some of the heritage research. Here we have accusative marking sporadically here mixed in with the nominative, the zero marking. But the sentence is basically the company, the boy, Chorancho, the bad frog, the turtle, the dog, on the raft, sailed. It's not clear why the raft, this should be an instrumental, but it's in the accusative, on the river. So we just see this massive takeover of the accusative case as if the speaker knows that you should have some sort of case marking, but doesn't know what it is. This perhaps is some interference from Russian. For example, in Russian, you see here, this is a Russian borrowing, kampania, and Russian feminine nouns end in a in the accusative. So this echoes that. This is the Evenki word for frog, but the Russian word for frog is also a feminine noun, ligushka, ends in a. So maybe there's something going on there, but here, if this were a Russian word, it would be a masculine word. Phonologically, that's the form of a masculine word, although the usual word for dog is feminine. So it's really unclear what the speaker is doing. And this is not patterning. This looks like really shifting speakers who don't know, a shifting speaker who doesn't know this. So this speaker appears to be very idiosyncratic and shows very low proficiency in the target language. So we need to look at proficiency if we're looking at the spread of changes. That's basically the point here. I want to take a few minutes, I'm running out of time, but I want to look at restructuring, which is one of the claims, and it's sort of at the heart of what's going on. The question being, as speakers are shifting from A to B, are they restructuring language A on the model of language B? And many linguists claim that this is happening. I am not finding evidence for that. That's the sort of takeaway message for that. I'm finding loss. I'm finding paradigmatic leveling. The simplification complexity is just a totally separate talk, but the restructuring really is a question. So if we had restructuring, we would imagine the borrowing of the entire morphosyntactic construction. And this happens with older Evenki, with speakers who are really dominant in Evenki. They borrowed a construction from Russian. It's this nada construction. Nada in Russian means it's a impersonal modal adverb, and it takes no morphology whatsoever, and it's used with an infinitive. There's no infinitive in these languages. So here in older Evenki, so this speaker was born in 1934. I recorded her in 1998. She didn't speak much Russian. My Russian was much more proficient than hers. She used this construction nada with a purposive converb instead of the infinitive, but it is a question, an issue of pattern borrowing in the sense of matras and sakal, or calking, if you will. She's taken that construction, adapted it again using Evenki resources with this modal, and we can flip through that. We get grammatical replication of that, whereas the she just really ran with this, adding morphology to it. That is not what we get in the wild. Instead, what we get more in the wild with even this speaker, older, the last one, or younger, born later, is doing what we see with the more younger speakers, a lot of code mixing, and instead of using Evenki morphology here, she just switches to the Russian. And so what we see with these speakers, and I wouldn't call this speaker a shifting speaker. She's completely proficient in Evenki, but the norm for her is to use a multilingual, a bilingual repertoire. She's using Russian and Evenki all the time and just switches back and forth. So this is a kind of code switching that we see a lot in the literature and quite common here. When Larido, who's a student at the university in Yakutsk, and she is herself from the same village where I collected the data in 1998, she went back in 2023. She's young and collected data there. And she is finding, using the same methods that we've been using in Birozovka, a lot of changes in word order. So Evenki and Evan, as I said, are V final, and we expect that verb pretty much always to be at the end of the sentence. Adverbial phrases can come afterwards, but we really expect it to be V final. She found advanced language shift compared to when I was working in the village in the 1990s. Not surprisingly, 2023, so 25 years since I recorded those other speakers. Very heavy code mixing, where I would find speakers who would speak Evenki with very limited Russian. Conjunctions, interjections might be in Russian. So she found extensive use of Russian conjunctions, a lot of code mixing, and she found word order changes. This is straight from that bridge story that you saw. So on the bridge, they met a brown one and a moose. This is the word for bear is taboo in Evenki. And we see the subject as at the end of the sentence, completely unpredicted for V final languages. So we see a lot of moving around of the verb, and this looks like it is under Russian influence. We might expect some typological restructuring as the word order changes. So Russian is prefixing and suffixing, but the target languages here, Evan, Evenki, Saha, the straight agglutinative, they're suffixing. They don't use prefixes, they don't use prepositions. They're really sort of typologically consistent. We're finding very little of that, actually. Let me, this is just too much. Let's go on to the word order here. So we find in Evan, this is the same sentence that we just saw in Evenki. On the bridge, they met the brown one and the moose. The conjunction here is borrowed from Russian. This is an exact calc from the Russian. If we look at the Evan stories that were collected, a lot of speakers, even highly proficient speakers, are using this Russian presentational word order is what it's called in Russian, where you're beginning a story or a new episode and you're introducing new characters. This is very common, and this has entered Evan and Evenki for sure. It does seem to be restructuring, at least a pragmatic kind of restructuring, a discourse level restructuring on the basis of Russian. Otherwise, not grammatical restructuring. This one, met, bridge, that's a borrowing, but here we have on, prolative case, third person singular, on the bridges, along on the bridge. It's completely even grammar, but just word order changes. More here with a more complicated sentence, we see the new information along it, past the rabbit with the mink. So we see this kind of changes in these changes in word order. And what we see as we step back and look at what's going on with the speakers with lower proficiency, we can tell that their proficiency is lower by their linguistic behavior. There's lots of hesitations, false starts, repetitions. They speak to the researcher in Russian. They ask questions, they respond, they speak to themselves in Russian. They use a very limited lexicon. There's a lot of code mixing, a lot of grammatical errors. As they retell that bridge story, which it's a short movie, it's only 2.5 cartoon, it's only 2.5 minutes, but they're working hard to tell it in the target language. And as they get toward the end, they start speaking Russian. They just get really tired. So, and the really weaker ones, lowest proficiency, they can't retell the cartoon in the target language. They might be able to do this picture production task, but they can't do the cartoon in the language. So here's an example of somebody who's much lower proficiency, and you can assess her proficiency level just from her performance is one of my points. So you can see she says, there was, and there, this means at that place. It's kind of an odd construction here. The bear, this is Evan, and bear is not taboo, and reindeer, and here she is trying to get the third person plural pronoun, and she can't do it. She starts, there should be an N there. She can't, she's got 2 false starts. They fought. And came a rabbit, this Russian word order, and a raccoon. So you can see by looking at this, I'm not looking at the fluent ones, but you can tell this is not a high proficient speaker. And it keeps going on. So if we generalize from her speech, we see very limited lexicon. She's dropping most of the objects. She drops them in the prompts in the 27 picture production. So she'll make a verb, a subject and a verb, but won't put in the object. We see phonological reduction, which was also predicted by Campbell and Munsell, if you remember back to that. Single consonants instead of geminates. She uses the prompt from the pictures for unfamiliar verbs. The word order is all over the place. We're expecting rigid V final, and we're not getting it. Even V initial, we tested this using PsychoPy with acceptability judgments. Nobody accepts this V final, V initial word orders, and yet she's producing them, often using the converb as opposed to a finite form, and she's speaking Russian a lot. So we can see the lower proficiency. We see here's a speaker who's trying to show this, and Liana is interviewing her, trying to get her to say, so she starts out, there's a bear and a reindeer. So what did the bear and the reindeer do here? Then she says bear and reindeer, and then she makes up a word. This is a word that doesn't exist. She's probably aiming for this tikritan. Liana gives her the word, and then she's repeating the syllable again, and they fell, right? So you can see a real lack of proficiency in these examples. She has good comprehension, little to no production. She's confident in some of her knowledge. Oh, the high proficiency people are confident. I'm running over time, so I won't give you the data here. I just want to show you that a speaker who's really proficient takes the resources and does unexpected things. So we expected from this picture, the man caught a fish with the rod. We expected man, fish accusative, rod instrumental, caught. And instead, the proficient speakers throw the prompts out the window and just say it the way they would say it. They're highly confident. They criticize me in the task and create a word to rod fish. Full morphology here, full inflectional morphology. And they're saying this is how they would actually say it. This sentence is itself artificial, whereas those weaker speakers can't produce it. So we could go on through this. So the changes are more along the lines of loss than restructuring. Perhaps there's incipient restructuring across the shifting speakers, but we see no evidence of it spreading. Instead, they're not using that target language unless they're speaking to older people, and even then they're speaking to them in the majority language. They're not generally using it. We're forcing them to in these experiments. So instead, they're using the majority language of Russian or Saha, and when we force them to use the target language, they code mix. And that's what's going on. So we don't see at the moment massive evidence of an emergent speaker community of shifting speakers who speak among themselves. We also aren't seeing, but I think this might be that we just don't have the data. We aren't seeing uses of the target language as a marker of identity. And that's really an open question. So one could imagine them pulling in little resources, lexical, phonological, to signal that they're Even or Evenki. They don't seem to be doing that. We have no evidence of it, but again, that's an open question. But instead, they're just shifting to the majority language. Getting back to this question about the heritage speaker, these Biryosovka low proficiency speakers, and I didn't go through the data because I spent so much time on methodology, they aren't the same as heritage speakers socially, at least. They're living in their homeland. They have, in Biryosovka, it's an Even dominant village, so they can converse walking down the street in Even. They just don't. The school education is all in Russian, and there are people in the village who don't speak much Even. But the thing is that there's no elsewhere to go to. They can't go back to Poland and speak Polish. They're there, and that's the community. There's one other village where it's being robustly spoken. It's a different dialect, so they don't really, there's some tension, so they don't really get together and speak, although they could. So at least socially, they're different, and they just seem to, when they don't have the resource in Even, rather than speak so-called broken Even, which is what it's often called in the literature, they just switch to Russian in this village. So thank you. I will end here so we can talk a little bit, but I want to end with a picture of two of my colleagues. Colleagues. Igor, who's ethnically Evenki, but grew up speaking Saha. And of course has acquired Russian, so he's bilingual in Saha and in Russian. He feels very strongly that he is Evenki. And here's Boris, who's ethnically Even. He also grew up speaking Saha, that's his home language. He's trilingual. He acquired Even as an adult speaker out of a sense of commitment. Igor feels bad that he doesn't speak Evenki. Boris speaks Even. He speaks a different dialect than in Biryosovka, but he is now looked up to by Even speakers as a very proficient speaker. He's a phonetician, so he got, he did a really good job learning it. But this is kind of the reality of language shift in these areas. So let me stop sharing and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Lenore, so much. Great for the great talk, for sharing this data, new to us. To me at least. There is a question in the chat, so maybe from two questions, okay, from two colleagues. So first, Lydia Mitic, she asks, she says that's a great talk, and thank you for sharing the research. And the question is, with two typologically very different languages, what part of the heritage speakers' language knowledge attracts most?
That's a good question. I think if I had to answer, this is just sort of, I can't support this with rigorous data. I think what's going first and most is complex syntax and embedding. And we seem to see, we're still going through the data, but we seem to see a loss of the converb system. So Evan, Evenki, and Saha all have a very complex converb system. Russian has a very limited converb system and in general does subordination with finite verb forms. It looks like those converbs are being lost. We haven't checked rigorously to see how much people can produce, but in general, they are not using them. So actual usage suggests that those are going more than anything else. We do see other things. It's just that it looks like complex syntax, and in particular that, again, that would be how I would answer that. We specifically are looking at typologically distinct languages so that we could have Russian and really see, see where these differences would pop up. What we're not seeing, and it's been attested in Northern Romani dialects, introduction of prefixes and introduction of prepositions. I'm seeing some code mixing where you'll get a preposition from Russian and then an Evenki converb. I saw that with very older, highly proficient traditional speakers in Evenki, just a couple of instances. But now the younger people don't do that. They just switch to Russian. So that's some of the data that I flipped through. It's a good question. And that's still open. But that would be my guess.
And maybe following this question, maybe things that lie in interfaces between morphosyntax and pragmatics also, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, and the next question from colleague Maria Mithiakis. She says, great talk, and she liked really much the acronym. And she has two questions. Could we say that you combine experimental psycholinguistics and psycholinguistic and ethnographic sociolinguistic methodologies? That's the first.
Yes, and I would add to that, we're also doing traditional linguistic elicitation. So just to see what speakers actually can do when it's elicited as opposed to what they do. But I do think it's really important to combine the ethnographic sociolinguistic methodologies, again, to see what's going on versus, and then the experimental stuff so we can get data across a lot of speakers. Mostly people are not doing that in endangered language research. And so we just don't know if patterns emerge.
Mm-hmm. And the second question of Maria is, if I didn't miss a lot, is proficiency correlated with social variables such as age, gender, etc.?
It seems to be correlated with age, although not completely. One of the slides it seems to be to go with age. So the younger speakers are more likely to be shifting, although their older speakers have shifted completely. And it also seems to be correlated with lifestyle. So people who are living with the reindeer herds or actively engaged in what are often called traditional, but that's wrong because it's not, they're still doing it, but they aren't using it like a traditional, but if they're using subsistence or partial subsistence lifestyle, if they're actively engaged in that, they tend not to shift, although I flipped through a slide because I have one speaker who is patterning with lower proficiency, and her job is the chum worker. So the chum is like a Siberian tent. It's a traditional Evan dwelling, and her job is to take care of the chum. And so she's living a completely traditional, and it's, you don't find a chum in the village, you find it out where the people are with the reindeer herds. So her job indexes a very traditional lifestyle, and yet she's older, she's middle-aged, she's patterning like the younger speakers. So, and she's also got lower levels of education. It does seem to be the more educated people are, education's in Russian. If it's in there's some Saha immersion, but you still need to pass standardized tests in Russian to get into the university. So education is clearly a factor. The chum worker just shows that Anybody can shift anytime. She patterns with the young, low proficiency people, but we see big differences. The slide I skipped over, we looked at Liana interviewed during COVID. She interviewed families and members of the families, and where the older people, and they aren't that old, in my opinion, like maybe 60, the reindeer herders are speaking one way, and they're the guys who are refusing to follow the prompts exactly. They complained about the video. They said, children will never understand this. This is so unrealistic. The bear wouldn't throw the rabbit over. The bear would just eat the rabbit. Animals don't behave this way. They complained about things not being realistic. They're really proficient. They also mix in more Russian because they just aren't thinking that way. They aren't thinking, from what I can tell, but they can say anything they want. Their wives sometimes are a little bit less proficient, and their kids, we have this across 3 families, the kids are the ones who are the weaker. So definitely with age, we don't have enough data to talk about gender except in terms of professions. So women are not herders and they don't hunt in these communities. And we see that the ones who are sort of the most traditional, even though traditional can include mixing in Russian, they've been in contact for centuries. It's those reindeer herders who are taking more of the nouns and incorporating them to make different verbs. So in that respect, but that also correlates with lifestyle. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Zoe?
Okay, thanks for this really inspiring talk, because while you were talking, I was thinking of new paths in our research. So I would like first to ask some general questions. So you said that there is no education, no schooling in these languages. So schooling is only in Russian. Is that true for all the 4 languages you've mentioned?
No, so there's schooling, there's in Evan, in Berezovka. So by law, it's complicated. The language policy of the Sakha Republic says that in those areas where the autochthonous indigenous people live, so it's not all language groups, but the autochthonous ones, they have the right to education in their language. So in Berezovka, there is education in the language. I think it's 2 hours a week in the schools, and I went to the classes. I went to the classes in the school. The speaker, I showed the picture of the woman fishing, that was the teacher. And she told me that about half the kids speak enough Evan at home that they do really great in class, and half the kids don't. So we're seeing shift even in Berezovka, but it's very limited. So it's teaching Evan as a second language. There's not instruction, say in math, it's not used as a medium of instruction. In Sakha, Sakha is an official language of the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia. And technically, parents have the option of putting their children in Sakha immersion schools where the primary language of education is Sakha. They also have sort of bilingual education, but it's aimed not at transitional bilingual education as much of, but that you should be fully fluent in both. However, this is a fraught issue because there are very limited numbers of schools and limited numbers of teachers and limited amount of pedagogical training. So there's a few of these schools, and there's a parent association which is making a lot of complaints about lack of access. Once you get to the university level, everything is in Russian, and you must pass a standardized test to get the equivalent of a high school diploma. That standardized test is in Russian.
Okay, so even there is this law, there is not real institutional support to these languages. Okay, so this brings me to another question I would like to ask. You said that some of these people who participate in your sample may speak even 5 languages. So I would like to ask if there is, these languages are distributed functionally, meaning there are certain communicative situations in which a specific language is used or not.
So where we have that in the video that I showed you that's in the lower Kolyma region. And no, actually, they aren't functionally distinct. So and it seems to be remnants of small-scale multilingualism, as Frederica Lübke has described for parts of Africa. So the speakers, it tends to be the older speakers, and they'll easily have 4, 5, 6 languages in their repertoire, and they may identify as ethnically X and speak that language. The person who's been working on this is herself Yukagir. She's gotten the best data. She's on the team, and she's Yukagir. And the Yukagir speaker, there's 2 Yukagir languages from a linguistic. The details are quite complicated, but relevant, actually. So very small number of speakers. The Yukagir speakers, let's say an Evan walks into the room, that Evan in this region will also speak Yukagir, but the Yukagir speakers are speaking Yukagir, but when the Evan comes in, out of respect, they all switch to Evan. And then a Chukchi speaker comes in, and they all switch to Chukchi. So they have these linguistic repertoires, and they can flip around through them, and there doesn't seem to be exactly the same kind of social hierarchy. It's a remnant of the system that's in Africa. I can say that it's further complicated by this association between identity and language. And so all of the data you need to look at with a grain of salt. For example, I was with a PhD student who now has her degree, who was focusing on Chukchi. We were working with the person who was considered to be the best Chukchi speaker in Yakutsk. The Chukchi live really far north, and so they're hard to get to. So we were working with this woman, an older woman, and we were interviewing her in a mix of Russian and Chukchi. And she learned that I was studying Evan. She was like, "Why don't you speak any Chukchi?" I said, "Well, I'm not studying Chukchi. Jessica's studying Chukchi. I'm studying Evan." As soon as she learned that I was studying Evan, she switched to Evan and started quizzing me in Evan. She was testing my Evan. And then afterwards, I said to her, "How come you speak so much Evan if you're Chukchi?" And she said, "Well, my parents are Evan." I said, "I grew up speaking Evan in my home." So I said, "How come?" "Oh, that's interesting." I'm trying to ask neutral. I said, "How come you speak such good Chukchi?" She said, "Well, I'm Chukchi." So I said, "How come you're Chukchi, but your parents are Evan?" So, so it just doesn't follow the way you would think. And she said, "Well, I grew up in a Chukchi village, and I grew up speaking Chukchi with my friends, so I'm Chukchi." And again, it wasn't just her. It was like all of Yakutsk said, "Oh, if you really want to speak, go talk to this lady. She's the best Chukchi speaker." So it's identity and language it's really quite complicated. Also, another story, I was working with a family where there's the parents are Evenki, and parents spoke Evenki, very good speakers, and they had 4 children, adult children. 2 of them are twins. And the male, the woman identified as Evenki, and in the Russian passport, it used to put down your ethnicity was in the passport. Her passport said she's Evenki. Her brother, her twin brother, had in his passport that he's Saha.
How come? How is that possible?
So I said, that was my question. They said, "Oh, all the men in our family are Saha."
Okay.
Didn't speak any Saha at all. That guy, of those 4 kids in that family, the twin brother, was the only one who spoke Evenki. He's a hunter, and he spoke fluent Evenki, and he was less proficient in Russian by a long shot. All the others were monolingual Russian speakers. So
it's complicated.
It's complicated. It's really complicated. And it shows the importance of having really, not just doing a rigid questionnaire, but having these deep conversations to find out language and identity. That's also why I look at when we get DNA samples, looking at population across this region. Unless you have a large sample and you really do that ethnographic work, like the Chukchi speaker, who knows who her parents were, right? So people are going back as many generations as possible. But the ones
biolinguistics as well, not only sociolinguistics, but biolinguistics as well. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have a question myself, so maybe some two or interrelated questions. So I was wondering whether you think that quality of input does play a role, in the sense that maybe the input they receive, whether it plays a role. And my next question following to that is whether the age of onset to the language also plays a role. In the example, for instance, that you mentioned with accusative. So yeah, some thoughts.
That's of course, the linguist in me thinks it must, right? It's hard to imagine. We don't have good data on that. So where we have data is, so the accusative and the data I was showing there, that comes from the elicitation that Liana did across families, most of it. And then Buddies went and did some elicitation. So it was all elicited in Evan, but those weaker speakers are the children of the reindeer herders. And so it's hard to imagine that they wouldn't get good, they're getting probably the best input you could get. What we do find with some of the speakers, when the older speakers, 50 or so and older, there was there still is a boarding school system in Russia, as you know, as in the US and Canada and Australia, where children were taken from their families and put into these boarding schools, and they deliberately mixed groups so that they were punished for speaking their language, very similar to what happened in the US. And based on the speakers' own biographies, their autobiographies, we assume that they had interrupted transmission, that they went away, and they tell stories about being taken from their village, being sent to a boarding school, then coming back to the village and not being able to speak to their parents. So they have that experience. But that's the only way we're really getting at the interrupted transmission historically. I do think it's different than when we find these older speakers say, oh, I haven't, nobody speaks to me anymore in Chukchi. In Chukchi in particular, it's a kind of, well, it's all heartbreaking, but they're quite isolated, and yet the shift has been, we aren't finding younger speakers learning it. So we do have younger speakers like Buddies, who learned Evan, the guy from the last picture, who's co-author on some publications with me. The Evan accept him as a very proficient speaker, and he acquired it later in life. He must have at least been at university level. So, but he's a phonetician and a linguist, and grew up bilingual, basically. So that also has that bilingual advantage in language acquisition. We don't have good data on that. I'm kind of rambling here. I would love to be able to answer that question with data, but it's a little bit too anecdotal at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Any other question? It's very interesting because it's a totally different population, and it's not the classical heritage speakers or bilingual speakers or whatever. So yeah, it's very interesting. Zoe?
Maybe Elena first, because I've spoken before, so maybe Elena.
Okay, so Elena.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to ask if there is a plan for a further teaching for these languages. Have you ever considered it?
For teaching the languages? Yeah, so so it differs with the languages. So there are a lot of language activists in of the Saha language, and the Saha people are a very proud people. They're very proud of their heritage. They're Turkic. They're very much aware of that, and there's a lot more of them, and they are the ethnic majority in the Saha Republic. There's more than 50%. It's not a huge majority, but it's more than 50% of the population. That makes them quite unusual. They are actively promoting the Sahan language, and the lab is promoting this, and the majority of the researchers in the lab are Saha. Evan has shifted less, and there are some activists there as well, and there are people like Buddies who've learned it. There's some dissent among Evan speakers about really basic things like orthography, which stands in the way. There are also a very small population of speakers. We don't really know how many there are. Chukchi, who are way up in the north, and linguistically really interesting because of polysynthesis. They have totally different, they're also very proud, and they're the one ethnic group that the Soviets never dominated. But we don't have younger Chukchi researchers. So the lab that I work in, that I lead in Yakutsk, part of it is promoting these researchers and training people to be linguists. And a lot of them are mostly driven, in particular, Evan and Sahar are driven by a desire to improve language teaching. We haven't been able to identify a Chukchi who wants to come. There's another language also, Dolgan. They're interested. So at the community level, sometimes people are very interested in promoting the language, and they look to my partners who live in Yakutsk because they have direct lines to the government and can get resources. So it's but I would say the most active group are the Saha, were the most powerful and the largest.
Thank you so much, Vicky. And then Zoe, the last question, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. I would like to take this opportunity, given your extensive experience, I would like to ask a question about revitalization programs and strategies. A general question. Do you think that all these efforts about revitalization should only focus on preserving the traditional forms of the heritage language, or it might be also effective to accept and incorporate some of these changes?
So, well, thank you for that question. That's, of course, the million-dollar question with revitalization. My opinion, I have a strong opinion. And I think that we should do as much as we can to promote the language, the systems of the younger speakers. That's not popular in all communities. So one of the things I try to do when I'm in the community is talk about language change as a natural process. Because, and I point out repeatedly, I don't speak the way my grandmother did. I just don't. My grandmother criticized my English all the time. And I grew up in a monolingual household. So, so I think this is a big problem. I do think that the conservative, if I can call them that, the people who want to preserve that traditional museum style, I mean, then they're treating the language as a museum piece. I don't think that that's a winning strategy. We see a lot of younger speakers who are put off by being told that they speak bad X, or, that the elders are the ones who are actually blocking revitalization. And so that is a big problem. And I don't know what we do about that, except try to use our expertise as linguists to just talk about language change as natural. It is interesting that most of these changes, even the shift, and I think that the other piece of it is, these shifting speakers are using multilingual repertoires. They're speaking, there's a lot of code mixing, and purists always think that's bad, but multilingual people do it, and that's kind of the norm. So the more that we can do to promote that as positive, in my opinion, it's not a popular opinion in a lot of communities, but that's where I think we really need to put some effort. Especially, that's one thing as a linguist I can do, get people to be more accepting of innovation.
Okay,
I think that if you're, if you're a Chukchi, if you have a Yukagir, like one of those Yukagir lines, there's 20 speakers on a good day. Like, you should be happy if anybody uses anything, right? But it's not my language, it's not my community. But yes, I feel pretty strongly about that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Thank you. And maybe the last question from Joy.
Okay, yeah, it's maybe relevant. So we know there's data showing that the more domains in which a lesser spoken language is used, the more likely it will be maintained. And actually, where minority languages have resisted language shift, we have data about that. The longest, there has been at least one exclusive domain for this lesser spoken language. Do we have similar data about Tuksi or Even or Sakha that they fall into this category, that they are used in a specific domain or not?
We don't have, I would say, hard data, but we can extrapolate from what we have, except there's a confounder, and it also applies in Greenland, which is an interesting contrastive situation because it's in Greenland, it's the national language, Greenlandic.
Okay.
The domain where, the last domain that's really important is the home, which is, that's not surprising. What we are finding across these communities is that the majority languages coming into the home through the internet. And in particular, in Greenland and in Siberia, parents are complaining about YouTube and YouTube children's programs that are sort of, the kids get hooked on them. And in Greenland, children are acquiring English. So Greenland was colonized by Danes, so that's the second language there, and in many ways, the dominant language. The kids are learning English. Their parents may not speak any English. And the parents are complaining because they can't understand their kids. And kids are speaking English. In Siberia, throughout Siberia, they're learning Russian. And the parents are complaining about this a lot. And they're learning what they call a YouTube variety of Russian. I don't know exactly what that is. I can kind of imagine it's more sound bitey or something. That's something that needs to be studied. But it looks like that sacred domain of home is being invaded. Then the other domain, of course, where we anticipate that we would find this robustly would be, reindeer herding, hunting, but Russian is there. And we see that the other thing that's really interesting here is that the only language in the Russian Federation that people shift to other than Russian is Saha. So there are lots of communities that have shifted to Saha, even a new variety, Dolgan, or traditionally Evenki, reindeer herders who don't speak Evenki now. There's a lot of Evenki borrowings in the language, but they're speaking a Saha variety. So yeah, it's complicated, but it looks like YouTube is the enemy.
And TikTok. It's also TikTok.
Yeah.
YouTube and
People
TikTok.
haven't said, they haven't, TikTok, not so much, but YouTube.
Not so much? Yeah, strange.
Maybe, that's not what the people have flagged, YouTube.
It's globalization, actually.
Yeah,
It touches also this region.
Internet globalization, yeah. And the internet seems to be doing what language policy didn't manage to do. Yeah.
Thank you, Lenore, for this amazing talk. We really thank you. And we hope to see you again.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and for setting it up. And it's really been great speaking to everyone. I really appreciate the very thoughtful questions, especially since I was quite chaotic there, trying to get through too much.
It was fantastic. Thank you so much. So we others see you on January.
Yes.
22. Okay.
Bye. Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.